Welcome to the Nerdio Manager for WVD demo of the day. In today's video, we are going to be looking at a new feature that allows you to scale in and reduce the capacity of any given host pool to 0 active hosts outside of working hours. This is a new feature that is available in Nerdio Manager starting with version 2.0.1. And in all prior versions, there was a minimum number of active hosts that would have to be running 24/7. So let's go ahead and open up one of our workspaces and take a look at any of our dynamic host pools on the Manage Auto Scale screen. So there is a setting here called minimum active host capacity. And if this number is set to 1, for example, that means that the system is always going to maintain at least one active host 24/7. Now, why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to shut it down outside of business hours? Well, the reason is because you may have some users that need to utilize the system outside of business hours. Maybe somebody needs to work at night or needs to work on the weekend. So there, it's a good practice to maintain some minimum amount of capacity to support any ad hoc user sessions that need to happen outside of business hours. Now, one of the reasons to not maintain any active host capacity is because you want to save on costs. You may not want to have any active hosts during weekend or night hours. And there are two ways to do it. Either you can allow the system to scale in down to 0 hosts by specifying 0 here, or another way to achieve a similar amount of savings is by purchasing a reserved instance for the one VM that's going to be running 24/7. That provides a fairly significant compute discount. It's not usually quite as large as actually scaling the system in all the way, but it does give you both a cost savings and some capacity during the night and weekend hours to allow users to work. For the purposes of today's video, we're going to be looking at the scenario of wanting to shut down and remove all capacity during night and weekend hours, which is accomplished simply by specifying 0 in the minimum active host capacity field. Now, if you think about this, if you specify 0 here, that means after business hours, let's say after 6 p.m. Central Time, the system will go ahead and scale itself in all the way to 0 hosts. And once it does that, well, there is no such thing as a CPU threshold trigger, for instance, that can power that machine on because, well, there is no CPU utilization on this host pool since there are no active hosts in the host pool. So in order to use a 0 minimum active host capacity, there are some prerequisites. Prerequisite number 1 is that there must be pre-staging enabled. Pre-staging is what will turn on any hosts that have been turned off by the scale-in process. So let's go through a specific example. So we're going to have a base capacity of 5, a minimum capacity of 0. We are going to scale in after 6 p.m. once the CPU utilization drops below 40%. So imagine you're running, it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the CPU utilization is high, and there are 5 VMs in the particular environment. 6 o'clock rolls around, users are logging off, CPU utilization goes below 40, and the system starts shutting down and, if necessary, removing VMs based on our config up here. And then by the end of this period, so let's say by 7 o'clock or 6:30 or so, all 5 VMs are shut down and there is 0 active capacity, which means that if users try logging in right now, they would get no active capacity and no active session. Pre-staging is going to then trigger that capacity to turn on. So we'll enable pre-staging to be Monday through Friday by 8 a.m. And we'll tell the system that we want to have 2 active hosts by 8 a.m., which is then going to allow the system to turn on those machines as needed, well, not as needed, but by 8 a.m., and they will be up and running. So scale-in will shut them down after 6, and pre-staging will turn them on by 8 o'clock the following morning. Again, important consideration when you're scaling down to 0 until 8 a.m. on Monday through Friday, there will be no available hosts. So any users who try to log in will not be able to get an active session. Now, that is how it works in multi-session desktop scenarios. In Nerdio Manager, there is a type of host pool called a single user pooled session desktop. And in the case of that desktop, each user gets a dedicated VM to run their desktop session. So let's take a look at the auto scale settings in that particular scenario. So again, here we can specify a minimum active host capacity of 0. And then the trigger that tells the system how many VMs to have available is called as maintain up to certain number of spare desktops. And what you'll notice is there is now a new dropdown. So for anyone who upgrades from a current version of Nerdio Manager for WVD, you'll notice that it is currently set to always. And this number here is going to tell the system how many desktops to always keep available. But if you want to scale in after hours down to 0, if you keep this setting as always, this condition will override this condition. So it will always keep one VM available because I have it specified as always, even though I told it the minimum is 0. And that is by design and is the intended behavior. Now, if you wanted to actually shut all of these VMs down outside of business hours, what you would do is you would change this drop down to be during work hours. And during work hours means between the hours of pre-staging. So let's say Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 a.m. Central Time, we would have 2 machines that would come online. And then scale-in would happen at 6 p.m. Central Time. And that means that only between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. would this condition apply. Once 6 p.m. rolls around and the system starts scaling in down to 0, the system will not power on based on this condition because it is not during work hours. So that's just an important nuance to keep in mind for this specific type of host pool when you're using single user pool desktops. So to summarize, we reviewed the process of scaling in down to 0 and having no compute capacity available outside of business hours, which is a great way to save on costs. And it is something that is fully supported in the Nerdio Manager for WVD auto scaling mechanism. I will see you in the next video.